So thank you everyone for coming. It's fun to be here to talk about a new project, something I'm working on right now. Minutes ago, I was in my office looking at 19th century documents, so it's exciting to be able to convey what I was looking at to this audience. So let's start with a hypothetical, because that's what we do. So I have to start that way. So let's suppose Congress wants to build a new eco-friendly national highway system. And some states already have adequate roads that can be used, but others have decrepit highways that have to be upgraded for electric cars because it's an eco-friendly highway system. And those states' legislatures are dominated by politicians who oppose federal funding. They don't like broad congressional power. They don't like the majority party in Congress. Some of them think the electric car industry will hurt American car makers. So they have lots of reasons to think that this is a bad program. So a handful of these states expressed their intention to resist the federal program. You can probably see where this is going. So the question is, can Congress threaten the states? And what kinds of threats does it have at its disposal? And indeed, can it threaten the states with the removal of funding, highway funding? Not just new highway funding for this new electric car program, but all highway funding, everything the states have gotten. So 6 months ago, let's say, the answer would have been yes, probably. They probably can threaten to take away all the highway funding, certainly a lot of it. And for that, we would point to South Dakota versus Dole, a case that many of you are probably familiar with. All of you will be familiar with at some point. And there, the court basically said, yeah, there's a conditional spending power that Congress has that means it can say to the states, do this, and we'll give you money. And if you don't do it, you don't get the money. And the states can sort of choose. That was, say, 6 months ago. In June, in the healthcare case that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, the court modified that answer. And there's a question about were they changing it or were they refining it. But after that case, since then, now, the court would say no. They would say Congress can't threaten all the existing funding. They can probably take away the new funding or threaten to take away the new funding, but they can't take away everything, not the pre-existing funding. It might depend on the percentage of total state revenue that the highway funding accounts for, but the answer would be no, you can't just take this all away. All right, what about 195 years ago? 1817, just to pick a date. What if you ask those people whether Congress could do this? Well, you would get a quizzical look, I'm pretty sure. Not just about the electric cars. You could tell them, well, it's like a Baruch Landau, but you know, it's different. The quizzical look, I think, would have resulted in the following kinds of answers. Well, yes, Congress probably can take away all of this highway funding you're talking about, these roads. Let's call them turnpikes. And the people in 1817 probably wouldn't see a big distinction between the old and new funding. But then they would probably ask, why this mechanism? Why this condition? And they probably would have said, Congress could appropriate money for the roads, these turnpikes. It can't oversee the actual construction, but the appropriation is probably OK, although we have trouble pointing to a particular provision of the text. And then they would ask, which state? Did the state consent? Was it one of the original 13, or was it a post-1787 state? What were the terms of its admission? So they would have asked different kinds of questions, obviously, from the kinds the court asks today. So why do I mention all this? Well, because in this period, in the early 19th century, not only were Americans facing a crisis of confidence, which I like to think of as a kind of adolescent uncertainty, they were watching the founders die all around them. I mean, they were. Some of them on the same day, a lot of them on July 4th, and not just the same July 4th. So Madison was one of the longest lived, but he died in 1836. James Monroe died on July 4th, 1831. And of course, famously, Adams and Jefferson on July 4th, 1826. And so there was this new generation of politicians and lawyers and judges and other people, observers, people discussing these questions, who were really trying to figure out how they could complete the founding, because they felt like that was their job. But on the other hand, they also felt like they were inadequate. So they would hear these stories from their parents about, in my day, we took the cannon off Boston Common so that the lobsterbacks couldn't get them. What have you done, Joseph Story? And little Joseph Story, at that point, hadn't done very much, although he obviously compensated. And little Joseph Story was upset about this, and so were a lot of these founders. So little Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, William Wirt, you name it. A lot of these founders in the 1820s and 30s are these politicians and lawyers and observers, commentators, newspaper writers, including women, including people who were not part of the dominant political elite, really felt like they had this task of working out what the founding was going to mean. And one of the central issues for them was the scope of Congress's power over what they called internal improvements. So these we could think of as public works projects, like roads and canals, turnpikes, later railroads. And there was a lot of controversy about these internal improvements. In fact, in several elections, believe it or not, presidents said, I have this position on internal improvements. It's a controversial issue. People really listened. And from Madison to Polk, at least, this was a big ground on which the presidents clashed with Congress. And the Supreme Court even entered the picture. So at some points, every politician had to make a statement about internal improvements. So this is Abraham Lincoln as a candidate for the Illinois State Assembly from Sangamon County in 1832, where he said that the poorest and most thinly populated countries would be greatly benefited by the opening of good roads and in the clearing of navigable streams within their limits is what no person will deny. So it has this very early 19th century flavor of progress and westward expansion and using these incredible rivers and streams that the United States believed that it had and was certainly expanding into in this period. So another thing that's interesting about this period, though, is it complicates a lot of the stories that constitutional law scholars tell about the history of certain doctrines. And indeed, the idea that certain doctrines don't have a history, let's say they were invented during the New Deal period, or that they have a history and it's been unchanged since the founding. So the conditional spending prong of these discussions, which I'll talk about, really adds insight on what history says to constitutional law. So I have three parts to today's talk. So the first is a quick primer on the spending power today. Second, congressional spending in the 19th century and how internal improvements fits in there. And then third, what this shows us about the universe of constitutional possibility, which I think changes at different periods. And that's a big part of the claim of this project, even when the text and the structure and the other components seem identical. So first, the spending power today. Some of you I know are hearing a lot about this these days, but it should always be on our minds because the healthcare case really has brought it back. So the healthcare case, National Federation of Independent Business versus Sibelius, you can tell it's an important Commerce Clause-ish case because people don't call it by its name, like the sick chicken case, right? That's what everybody calls it, or the steamboats, or the wheat case. Well, this is the healthcare case. So let me just take a minute to go over the parts of the case that I think are relevant for this 19th century discussion. So the holding, nobody needs a review on that, right, because we're Chicago students. But the first part is the individual mandate, and this is the one where the court said Congress can, do this under the taxing power, but not under the commerce or the necessary and proper power, right? So that's individuals can be required to purchase insurance or else pay a tax penalty. Second, and this is more relevant for us, the Medicaid expansion. So to the extent that Congress was threatening the states with the loss of existing Medicaid funding, the court said the program was unconstitutional. So new funding can be threatened. That's the essence of conditional spending, but not existing funding. And this, again, is Dole, that case I mentioned, with the highways in South Dakota and the age for the purchase of alcohol. So the story the court tells in these conditional spending cases is about states and their compliance. And since the 19-teens, 20s, these early cases, the idea had been, well, it has to be the case that the states can take or leave the deal. There has to be a condition. It's not just an order. They can't be pressured. They can't be coerced. And this idea of coercion is now back in the case law in a way that it hadn't been really since the 1920s. So this is something that a lot of people are watching for the next cases because there's a question of, oh, at some point we think that the condition is too coercive. So if you think about it, the way the court frames it in the healthcare cases, they say the states here have no real option. They can't lose all of their Medicaid funding. That's a huge part of their budgets. So the court said that this is tantamount to economic dragooning. And since in this realm they had previously talked about commandeering, it's clear that the court is really enamored of 18th century military metaphors, although they have switched from a naval metaphor of commandeering to an army one of dragooning. So unclear what that means, but it's worth keeping an eye on. Okay, so that's what the court did with conditional spending. And I think we'll be hearing a lot more about these conditional spending programs for this reason, that there is this idea that at some point the conditions are too onerous and the Congress is essentially compelling the states to adopt these programs. So under the ACA, the statute at issue in the healthcare case, it was more than 10% of the state's overall budget that the court was concerned about, and they said that's a really large number. So at some point, the court said it's too coercive. So one question that comes out of this case is, well, when do incentives become coercion? Now, we know the Chicago answer, right? They don't. They just become stronger and stronger incentives. And we would draw charts and graphs to show that. But the court isn't quite there yet. So they're not thinking about it that way. There's a sense that, well, at some point, the states have no real choice here. OK, so why are we even talking about conditional spending? This is where the history comes in. Well, if you think about all of these cases as basically being about Congress wants to do something, the federal government wants to do something, and it wants to get the states on board, it needs them for some reason, the most obvious way would be for Congress to just regulate. Issue direct regulation, it's in US code, they say this is what's going to happen, and that's what the individual mandate was. Congress regulates. But for some other provisions, Congress needs the states, or thinks it needs the states, or maybe thinks it can only do it through the states because it may not have direct regulatory power under the enumerated powers of Article 1. So that's where we get to the case of internal improvements in the 19th century. What's interesting here is just to try to re-inhabit this constitutional universe that people were living in that period. So they weren't thinking so much of what can Congress compel the states to do. That is often how we think of these cases now. Instead, it was a different question: what can Congress do in the name of the states? And how does the federal government draw on the states or use them as part of a larger regulatory program? So in these internal improvement situations, basically, this is all part of the tariff and nullification. I always like saying all these things together because everybody has, I know, you have a high school kind of tariff bank. It's all coming. Here it all is. So I'm just going to say it's all part of the same story. But you can think of it this way. The federal government sort of expanding in the early 19th century, not in ways that are really perceptible to people kind of living their lives. But one of the things that was happening because of the tariff and because of some of these other programs is increased federal money. Now you would think, why is that a problem? Well, to people in the early 19th century, some people, that was a problem because it meant the federal government will grow, the federal government will have this money that it will start throwing around, and there will be these surpluses or bonuses that the states will then be forced to deal with because the federal government has them, and that just means bigger federal government. So in a lot of these situations, what's happening is there's revenue there. And some parties, a portion of the Republican Party says, this is great, let's use it for navigable streams, waterways, roads, improvement. And others say, that's not what we're about. We're not doing Alexander Hamilton's commercial republic. We're not trying to have manufacturers going on in every town and city. Some people feel like it will threaten slavery and local institutions, right? There's a concern that expansive federal power could mean an end to those kinds of economic and other systems. So this is really a fraught consideration. So in this period, it's not just as simple, though, as people saying, we don't like Congress regulating. Because they draw these distinctions in some cases. So for instance, some people think Congress can appropriate, it just can't go out and build the canals, build the turnpikes itself. Other people think, well, Congress can probably tax and spend that money in certain ways, but it can't order the states to do it. So there are overlays with a lot of modern doctrine in kind of interesting ways. And James Madison, not surprisingly, even though this was very close to the end of his life, is part of some of these debates. So some of the most famous moments of confrontation involve Congress over and over passing these internal improvements programs, basically saying, wouldn't it be great to have a good road in the old Northwest, in the interior, like Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana? Yes, of course it would. Will any of the states do it on their own? No, they don't have money, they're not that organized, they might not have political will. So they start to have congressional programs of these sorts of projects, and of improving rivers, and of improving harbors, and of improving lighthouses. And so what happens is people in politics start to make arguments about why this can or can't be done, and then they go looking for support. Well, James Madison is still living at Montpelier, seems to accept correspondence from people pretty regularly, although he must have gotten pretty tired of it because everybody kept seeking him out. So you get these moments of Congress passing legislation, many presidents vetoing the legislation, although not all. This is often the story. Well, every president vetoed this internal improvements legislation. They thought it was unconstitutional. That's the story you will often hear in the literature. And that's not exactly what's going on. So let's talk about this more concretely. So there's a little bit of a paradox here in that these cases seem really analogous in certain ways. You can describe them at a level of abstraction that makes them sound a lot like the healthcare case and a lot like modern highway funding and all these other things. And yet they are very different in important ways that make them not perfect analogs. So like I said, there's this idea that the conditional spending power maybe came out of the New Deal, or maybe it's something that was kind of invented to counterbalance moments when Congress didn't have broad regulatory power. It's another way for Congress to get the states to do things. But I think what the 19th century example shows is that the spending clause intuitions were there all along, but they have taken different forms. So to the extent other scholars have said, well, there are these debates about internal improvements, they're kind of about the spending power, all they really show us, if anything, is that there was no firm original meaning of the spending power. I think it's true that there's no unified original meaning of the spending power, but it's not true that there was a sense that that all these internal improvements were unconstitutional. So some presidents did believe in them. John Quincy Adams, James Monroe early on said he did and then pulled back on that. Also, there were a lot more subtle distinctions going on. As I mentioned, this idea that Congress might be able to appropriate the money, but it couldn't actually implement or retain jurisdiction over the projects. So that's a refrain you see a lot. And some presidents, interestingly, urged constitutional amendments. So Monroe did this, Jackson, in a kind of indirect way, talked about constitutional amendments. So there's a real sense that they understand or think that some portion of the people in the United States, and this is a contested issue, but some portion of people in the US think these improvements would be good. They're living out in the hinterlands of Illinois or something, and they'd like to have a canal, they'd like to have a turnpike, and so they would like this program to happen. So you see these presidents often saying, well, I think it's unconstitutional right now, but how about an amendment? So in a series of letters in 1826, for instance, Madison, again, is contacted by Jackson's Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren. And Van Buren writes these letters, they're sort of heartbreaking in a way, because it's like, dear Mr. President, I hope Mrs. Madison is well. Remember your veto back a decade or so ago of an internal improvements bill? Let's talk about that. And could you say something that maybe the president and I could sort of use? And Madison takes this pretty well. And he says, OK, let's talk about how we could address this problem. This internal improvements controversy is just not going away. So Madison starts laying out structural options. And Van Buren gets very excited about this and then writes back and is sort of like, how about text of an amendment? Well, could we use this? Can we attribute it? And so what does Madison actually propose? Well, the first thing he says is, everyone is concerned about this. And Madison himself had been one of the big vetoers of internal improvements projects. That's part of the reason that he was being brought into this debate. So Madison says, why don't we just have a functional division of power between the general government, the federal government, that is, and the state government? So let's just say we all sort of agree that Congress can appropriate funds, but jurisdiction and actual construction implementation is allotted to the states. So Madison says this has a captivating aspect. a lot of people will like this idea. They like these distinctions. They like these institutional stories about competencies. It's like he's reading the minds of future con law people. But then he says, no, but we can't do it because it's too hard to define this in practice. How will we maintain this division? And it's just not reasonable, he says, to think the nation will be willing to fund projects without national oversight. So Congress will say, why should we give you this money if we know that we won't be able to say how the dam is built, how the canal is built? So Marshall says this is kind of a realist move here, given the fact that people generally support internal improvements, patronage and pork barreling will come in here. It's not realistic to think Congress will just sort of stay behind this barrier. It'll end up expanding its power. So he says, let's talk about constitutional amendments. So he proposes a couple of different kinds. One is a constitutional amendment that basically says, let's give Congress an enumerated power over internal improvements. Now, this is interesting because all the talk of constitutional amendments that people have conducted in the 20th and 21st centuries, you rarely hear them saying, let's add something to Article 1. Let's add an enumerated power, right? There's this sense that the enumerated powers are fixed, and you fight about where your particular program fits. But Madison says, no, let's have an amendment that says, Congress may make appropriations of money for roads and canals to be applied to such purposes by the legislatures of the states within their respective limits, the jurisdiction of the states remaining unimpaired. So what does that mean? Congress gives funds to state legislatures to use for roads and canals. The state legislatures will carry out the project. Okay. Well, this is all pretty telegraphic. He doesn't really get into this. But what happens if a state refuses? Well, other draft amendments that other people had circulated in this period said things like, well, the states have to consent. You can't make them build the road or the canal. But Madison's plan didn't say that. So it's sort of reasonable to think, well, okay, so maybe a state could refuse, but he hasn't really talked about this. He hasn't said consent is explicit. Now, in modern doctrine, this amendment would raise a lot of red flags. The first would be commandeering, this idea that Congress is now using the states to carry out its programs. So the big cases here, New York versus US, where Congress tries to get the states to deal with hazardous waste hauling and disposal. And the problem for the modern Supreme Court is this idea that Congress is using the states as its tools and that they're not going to be, they're not really going to have much choice, and accountability will be confused. Federalism principles will be violated. It's a straight command, and you can't do that today. Okay, well, so maybe it's a commandeering problem today. Is it a conditional spending problem today, or would it be okay? Well, that seems like another avenue that might be all right if you sort of said, well, maybe it's kind of like offering highway funding and it's kind of like putting a condition on it, but there isn't a condition here. There's no if-then in the statement. Madison doesn't put it that way. So he's not really troubled by the view of structure that I think modern constitutional lawyers would immediately say were problems with these programs. Okay, but then he's not done. So Madison says, well, also, if we think that we really want to just give Congress a broad power here because they're going to encroach anyway, so why not just be clear up front? Why not say Congress may make roads and canals with such jurisdiction as the cases may require? So this isn't just appropriating the money, this is building the roads and canals. So you could think of this as federal engineers are going to go out and construct the internal improvements. Is this tidier? Well, it's kind of tidier because it's federal all the way down. No one's going to be confused. Who is this building the canal here? I don't know. Oh, I know. It's the Federal Canal Building Agency. That's clear. So if I have complaints or if I have compliments, I know who to call. So it's tidier in that way. It doesn't implicate commandeering in the same way. It doesn't seem problematic for 10th Amendment reasons because the states aren't being used as instruments. But there are other modern doctrinal concerns for this. So first is just this idea that, well, now the federal government is expanding. Another agency is out there building canals and turnpikes. And this is a period where there weren't many federal agencies. So that would have been really startling to people. Also, some of these projects will be purely local, right? So you're sitting there in upstate New York, let's say, and this one isn't even purely local, digging a canal. And people may ask, well, why are you here, federal officials, right? I mean, Albany to Buffalo, sure, the song, the mule, but it's not really something that even goes outside New York, and that was true with a lot of these projects. So that would be another modern doctrinal concern, to the extent that some of these projects are purely local, right? This is always a red flag in doctrine about the commerce power. So if you think again about the healthcare case, the individual mandate side of things, the worry was Congress didn't have the power to get to these kinds of individual decisions. But Madison says, well, if Congress is going to grab the power anyway, it's better to cabinet ex ante. Then finally, Madison says, you know, while we're on the subject of amendments, he's always been bothered by the general welfare clause, which is the provision of Article 1 where the taxing and spending power is. It's always hard to even know how to refer to it, but basically the provision says the common defense and general welfare and taxing and spending are understood to come out of that language. Well, Madison, and this is in kind of the common discussion of this clause, had always felt that it should be interpreted narrowly since the drafting of the Constitution. So here in 1826, he says, you know, I don't like these terms, common defense and general welfare. It seems like it gives Congress the ability to just regulate anywhere it wants. Oh, general welfare. Let's have canals, let's have internal improvements. So he says we should add another amendment, add one about internal improvements, but add another amendment that changes the language of the general welfare clause to say either take out the phrase general welfare, common defense and general welfare, or add the following language. For the common defense and general welfare in cases authorized by this Constitution. So what does that do? Well, it would limit the general welfare clause to acting simply as a kind of enabler, a helper clause. It would be analogous to the necessary and proper clause in that it would say Congress can tax and spend to carry out its enumerated powers, other enumerated powers. That's contra Hamilton's view and the view that we've all kind of learned about the taxing and spending power, which is it's pretty independent. And indeed, if for proof of that, think of the healthcare case, right? In the healthcare case, the majority said the provision fails under the commerce power, it fails under necessary and proper, but it survives under the taxing power. You couldn't say that in the world that Madison is proposing because the taxing power would only be parasitic and an add-on to some other enumerated power. So the idea that it's freestanding under the taxing power wouldn't have made any sense to Madison. So that was Madison's full array of proposals, and you can really see that they strike at kind of every different problem that people might have seen with internal improvements. So his letter with the proposed amendments crossed in the mail with one from Van Buren. Van Buren was sending yet another congressional committee report on the subject of roads and canals. And in that letter, Van Buren derides what he calls the lame attempt of the committee to make out that General Washington was in favor of internal improvements. But then Van Buren is kind of unable to restrain himself. And then he says, well, but here's what I think Washington would have thought about internal improvements. So, you know, they're really trying to figure this out, but there's also a sense of what would George Washington have thought of this will clearly still be compelling to people. Okay, so what to make of all of that? Or why listen to James Madison yet again in yet another domain? Well, some of this, I think, tells us when not to listen to James Madison in a way, or when to listen to him only for limited purposes. Because all the structural and textual elements that Madison told Van Buren, and through Van Buren, Andrew Jackson, about, all the ones that were implicated in the internal improvements debates are still with us today. These are all the things the court was talking about in the healthcare case, but crucially, they're in different forms. So I think they are a lost history in that way and not a direct analog. So as I said, if Madison had succeeded in his reinterpretation of the General Welfare Clause, the healthcare case could not have come out as it did. And a lot of people think that the Chief Justice wrote the opinion the way he did. He was able to talk about the commerce power and necessary and proper as strongly as he did because he had the backstop of the taxing power to keep that legislation alive. So what would have happened without that is an interesting question. Second, Madison doesn't seem to really distinguish between Congress acting on individuals and Congress acting on the states. Today, those are conceptually different parts of the doctrine. So you could think in the healthcare case, again, the individual mandate is about Congress talking to individuals. The Medicaid provision is about Congress talking to the states. Internal improvement seems to us like it's mostly about what Congress can tell the states to do. But when Madison makes this connection to the General Welfare Clause, That seems more like it's talking about federal power over individuals, or at least blends those concerns. Again, not in a way that is wrong or means we should reshape our doctrine, but it's completely different. So to the extent we're trying to figure out, and you can find articles like this, what do the internal improvements debates tell us about this particular piece of modern legislation? The answer is, well, you got to be careful making these analogies because the landscape and the universe are so different. Now, also remember, all of this discussion is happening before the emergence of the modern conditional spending power. So in the case books, the first case is U.S. versus Butler. It's from 1926. There may be an old notes reference to a case about the carriage tax in 1796, but that's pretty different. That's even before John Marshall. I mean, that's really old constitutional doctrine. So if you even consider the different modes of congressional interaction with the states, commandeering as one, Congress to the states, do this. Direct regulation, Congress to the world, but mostly individuals, right? Buy insurance or pay a penalty. Or conditional spending, Congress to South Dakota, raise the drinking age or you'll lose federal funding for highways. These are all not, those concerns I think are the big three for modern constitutional law and federalism. They're not there in the 19th century, or they're there in different ways. So consent by the states cures their commandeering concerns. So there's a big sense in a lot of these cases, well, you know, yeah, we don't think this is right, but gee, if the state consented, well, it's probably okay. The Supreme Court today has said, no, state consent doesn't fly. It doesn't matter if they consent. They can't consent to giving up their sovereignty. And they're not worried about direct congressional regulation as long as there's a basis in the text. That's why they're going and thinking about, well, could we add an enumerated power? Is that a possibility? No one talks really seriously about that these days. They're worried about the spending power, sort of. I mean, that one is the hardest in a way because they don't conceive of it the way we do. But they don't seem to really worry about whether the state's being coerced or not. They're not insisting on a real condition. And to see this, you can think about the fix that in the 1840s people started being somewhat more comfortable with for internal improvements, which was Congress would give public lands to the states with the proviso that the states use them for improvements, railroads most often, sometimes lighthouses. And contemporaries seem to feel that that solved the worst problems. So to them, the big problem was Congress actually overseeing internal improvements. This seemed different. Today, our red flags would go up because we think, well, maybe there's a commandeering problem here. So their worries about the spending power are very different. Lands are given to the states. In some cases, it seems more or less that the states are required to build the railroad. And there was plenty of room for private profit. So Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas was a big proponent of this mechanism of dealing with internal improvements. And he was instrumental in setting the path of the Western Railroad, which was something that occupied Congress for much of the 1840s. And he was instrumental in the building of the Illinois Central Railroad, which is the one that goes right across campus and along the lake. And that was integral to North-South and Western development. Douglas speculated in land adjacent to the railroad, so he did get something out of it. And he was buried overlooking the tracks at 35th and Lakeshore. So, and his papers are at Regenstein. So we're in the place where a lot of this happened, and it's amazing to think they would not have understood the question in the same way that we would have. And it's not that long ago. This is the early 19th century. It's not even the 18th century. So what does it mean? What does all of it mean? What does it mean that an amendment was never passed? It's hard to say because it's clear that people wanted internal improvements in the sense that canals, railroads, steamboats, all of these things, you could find a constituency that said, this is good for us. This brings us connection with the outside world. This brings us contact with Europe. This brings us ways of thinking about individual rights. This brings groups that are left out ways of thinking about how they might get in. It brings economic development. A lot of presidents support internal improvements, at least for these national projects. And the barrier is seen as constitutional. So why no amendment? Well, we can look to Douglas for this, an idea of, I guess, accommodation through practice. They did come up with a workaround. In the 1840s, 1846, he said, there are some powers in the government that by this time ought to be conceded because of longstanding use. It's kind of deflating as a con law person, I have to say, to think, really? People just keep doing stuff and that becomes okay? But that's historical gloss, Youngstown, so maybe it is okay. And also, I think it just shows us the universe, again, is so different, and what we think are the problems about these kinds of federalism arrangements were different problems from what they thought were problems. And yet here we are living on in their universe with their precedents. So it's a cautionary tale, but I think it's a hopeful tale, too, about legal history. So now I'm happy to take people's questions about any of that. Oh, come on. I don't have a seating chart. It's not fair. But I know that, tariffs, all of this stuff is sort of overwhelming. But on the other hand, the healthcare case has really given life to all of this conditional spending stuff. Yeah.
Do you see the healthcare case as reopening the door for the Supreme Court to revisit South Dakota v. Dole, or do you think they're going to draw the distinction somewhere?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because Dole, on the one hand, conditional spending is so well established, but then when you press people, well, what's the case for that? It's always, well, Dole. And it's not a very long case. It's only about 12 or 13 pages, so it doesn't necessarily bear all this weight. What I suspect they will do, who knows, but one thing I think they could do, and they've left room for themselves on this, is say, well, in Dole, it was a much smaller percentage of the state's overall revenues, and there is that language in Dole where they say something, I think it's less than 5%. And there's some disagreement, you can tell, between the justices in Dole about whether that matters. But one idea that did come out of Dole was sort of, well, it's kind of a de minimis idea. And that's also because it's just the new funding. But it is interesting then on the flip side to think, okay, so that language was there in Dole, but when the drafters of the healthcare legislation drafted it, they didn't think, oh, we probably can't threaten them with loss of all of the funding. That's going to be a lot of funding. So I think it's there in Dole, but I don't think they'll cut back on it because, first of all, there's a practicality question of just how many programs that would involve. But also I think we'll see the legislation in future being tailored to say things like, it's only the new funding. Now, there is a question about, well, what if the new funding is some huge amount? If you accept the program, you'll get this enormous amount of money that could be a large part of your revenue. And if you don't, you don't get it, so do you get to count that? My guess is the court there would not be as troubled by it as they are in the healthcare case. But yeah, it certainly seems like, and you can see in Dole also some of the justices say, what about coercion? We should talk about coercion. Don't talk about coercion, coercion, coercion. So I think it is there. You can find Dole and harmonize it. You can find ways to harmonize Dole with the ACA case. Other questions? Well, I talked to the alumni about some of this. They had a lot to say, as you might imagine. But one of the big questions that people asked was this idea of, well, where's the federalism going on the court, too? Even as recently as a year or two ago, you would talk about the federalism of the court as something they were doing in the 80s and 90s. And so a question that people often asked was, well, does the ACA case mean federalism is back? And do the 19th century cases inform them in any way? And I think it's clear, A, federalism is back, for sure, to the extent it was ever gone. B, it's hard to say about these cases because still, this is probably familiar to many of you. If you try to figure out, well, you think you're done with enumerated powers. I know this feeling. You're in con law. You think we're done with the enumerated powers. And then there's this amorphous taxing power, and it's from a clause that doesn't even really say spending. And this period, I think, will give insight on, can give insight on where that's come from, and I think does help us think about conditional spending as the flip side of direct regulation. And that's something I expect the court to think about, to keep thinking about in the future. So we'll see. All right. Thanks.